All right, hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Danger Boys podcast. My name is Tappers, and today we're going to be looking at the third day of Gettysburg. This is the second part of my Gettysburg series. If you missed it, or it's just been a while, feel free to go down to the description, and there will be a link to a playlist that has all of the episodes of the Danger Boy podcast series. Feel free to listen to part 1 first, and then come on back for part 2. Part 1, we looked at the first 2 days of battle, and today we're going to be looking at the third day and the events that transpired, and we'll go over a little bit of what happens after the battle. So, in the early morning dawn of the third day, July 3rd, Lee creates a plan, right? And he's like, all right, we're just going to run it back, right? We're just going to do what we did on day 2, but, do it again, basically. So, yeah, that's what his plan is. Now, he wants to do something with Jeb Stuart, right? So if you remember to part 1, Jeb, he arrived to the battlefield late, right? Jeb had gone further north than the rest of the army, and now that he was back, right, he arrived on July 2nd, so now that he's back, Lee wants Jeb to attack the left flank of the Union line, and hopefully that with the frontal assault from the infantry, mixed with the left flank attack from the cavalry, this would allow the Union line to become overrun. Now, let's go to George Meade's plan, right? So, Meade, the Union commander, after the fighting ceases on the second day, Meade reinforces his center, right? He believes that Lee is going to perform an all-out assault on the center because the previous day, right, Lee had attacked the flanks of the Union line. And so Lee, right, would assume that, okay, the Union took a lot of losses on the flanks. They're going to reinforce the flanks. This is going to leave the center weak, and we'll attack the center. Meade knew that Lee would think that, and so, they're playing 4D chess here. And so Meade said, all right, he's going to try to attack the center because he thinks that's going to be the weakest, so we're going to reinforce the center. So, Ewell, who was a Confederate commander, if we remember back to part 1, had taken some ground on Culp's Hill, and so Meade wanted to take it back. And he also told Slocum to prepare for a artillery barrage at first light, right? So from dawn to roughly 11 a.m., right? General Longstreet, the Confederate commander, started to organize his men to the left of the 8th Corps, or sorry, 7th Corps of the Union. Roman numerals are tough. And the 7th was going to open up fire on Ewell's 2nd Corps. The bombardment, right, that they were preparing launches. After the bombardment, the Confederates launched their attack. 3 miles east of Culp's Hill, 2 brigades of Union cavalry under General Gregg set up a picket line behind the Union line. And General George Custer is in support of General Gregg when the Confederate artillery begins to fire. Now, both sides charge and countercharge, with the rebels eventually retreating after suffering major casualties. All right, so if we look over to the right, over here, we can see that this is the cavalry offensive that Jeb Stuart, that Lee had ordered Jeb Stuart to attack, right? So both the cavalry kind of head off to the left and off to the side a little bit of the main battle on the third day. And they get into a bit of a skirmish, right? And Lee was hoping that Jeb Stuart would overrun the Union cavalry. They did not. The Union cavalry held the line and force Jeb to retreat. So Lee creates a new plan, right? The original plan of let's just run it back, well, that's not really working. So he needs a new plan. Lee calls upon Lieutenant General Longstreet and Major General George Pickett to receive new orders, right? Lee, again, we talked about this a little, 5 seconds ago, that Lee believed that Meade would reinforce his flanks, and so the center would be weakest. Lee informs his generals, right, and lieutenants and et cetera, that Longstreet will oversee the attack, led primarily by Pickett's men, with help from A.P. Hill's corps. And before the assault, an artillery barrage would be launched at the Union Center to weaken them up, and then Pickett, Longstreet, and A.P. Hill would begin the assault. And we can see here where, over here on the right, the A.P. Hill's men in the center with Trimble, Pettigrew, Pickett, Rhodes. You have Lang and Wilcox, Longstreet's over to the sides. And we can see up here cavalry actions 3 miles to the east, right? So the cavalry action is happening a little bit off in the distance. So Longstreet's opinion, right? So Longstreet hates the plan, right? Longstreet realizes that an attack on the center is basically suicide. There's really no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Longstreet knows that it's a terrible idea. And in fact, after the war, right, Longstreet and Lee were not friends. Longstreet moves to New Orleans and never sees General Lee again. He writes memoirs where Longstreet criticizes Lee pretty heavily for some of his decision-making. He protested the plan to Lee, right? Lee says, okay, you're going to attack the center. Longstreet says that's a terrible idea. We shouldn't do that. He told Lee that, look, the men are going to be slaughtered before they even reach the Union line. And if they did reach the line, right, if they were able to traverse the field and get to the Union center, there wouldn't be enough men to do any damage to the Union line. Longstreet said he needed at least 30,000 men to pull off the successful attack. Lee retorted with that 15,000 men, who made up the majority of this fighting force, would be sufficient. Longstreet retorted that 15,000 men who could make that successful assault over that field has never been arrayed for battle, right? Longstreet's saying there's never been in the history of all of war, of all time, has there ever been 15,000 men that would be able to create and to be able to successfully assault, right? There's no fighting force in the world that would be able to do this. Lee stated, General, you are free to commence the assault, right? Lee's not having any of it. He doesn't care what Longstreet says. This is Lee's plan, and Longstreet will, perform his duties as a soldier and as an officer. So, we're going to see that too with over the course of this episode, that Lee's subordinates were not happy with Lee after this. Not happy at all. So the artillery barrage, right? So at about 11 p.m. on July 3rd, the artillery barrage begins. So there's 150 estimated, 150 to 175. The actual numbers kind of vary, but roughly 150 rebel cannons were stationed 2 miles away from the Union Center, right? And these artillery cannons, at this point in the war, they would have had rifling, and so they are, fairly effective at this range. Obviously, it would have been more effective closer up, but either way. So 150 rebel cannons open up fire on the Union Center. And the Union, they respond with their own cannon fire. They also have about 150. So in total, you had about 300 guns firing at each other for roughly 2 hours, which was the largest artillery barrage of the Civil War, right? They said that you could hear, the cannon fire from 10 miles away. That's how loud the cannons were. But the problem is, with all this cannon fires, there's a lot of smoke in the air, right? And so it makes it very hard to see your targets. So very quickly, this artillery barrage became extremely ineffective, with both sides launching cannonballs well over top of their targets. The artillery commander, Brigadier General Henry Hunt, had given the order, right, to cease fire to his guns. But he did it in a way that was slow, right? So he basically shut down his guns one by one to give the illusion to the Confederates that they were actually hitting their targets and they were taking out guns, right? If they all just stopped at once, then obviously it was a ceasefire. But if, over the course of a half hour or so, all the guns ceased to shoot, the rebels, hey, maybe we actually hit our targets. And of course, like I said, the smoke from the cannon fire would have been so thick that you couldn't see anything anyways. So all you had to do was, all you had to go off of was the sound of the guns. And this worked. This, kind of trickery, it worked. The South was under the impression that they had taken out the majority of the Union battery, which was not the case. Also, too, both sides were running dangerously low on ammunition. The Union was almost out. The South was also almost out. So Longstreet still, has the understanding that this is a terrible plan, right? That this attack will not work. And he was extremely reluctant to give the order to General Pickett to start the assault. Pickett, right, goes to Longstreet and says, "General, shall I advance?" Longstreet in his memoirs reflects on how he could not even give the verbal affirmative. He had to simply nod his head because he knew that thousands of his own men would soon be dead. And this grieved him and pained him so much he could not even speak. So as Pickett, rose to rally his men and begin the march, Longstreet convened with the Confederate artillery commander, Colonel Edward Alexander, to assess the ammo situation. Alexander stated that basically he had no ammo left, and it would take almost an hour to replenish the ammo, to bring it up from the reserve and to reload it. So Pickett's march across the battlefield would be mostly unsupported by artillery fire from the rebel cannons. We can see up here in the top right, just kind of an image of the an artist, reinterpretation of the battlefield. You can see the rebel line here marching across the field, and you can see there's like dips and hills and whatnot. This is very it's not a flat field, right? It's a very hilly field. So let's take a look at our line here. One of the important places we're going to look at is up in the top left. There's a place called Seminary Ridge. This is where the Confederates will convene at the end of the charge, right? They're going to be coordinating up here at Seminary Ridge. But across here, you can see this large field that the majority of the rebel force is going to be crossing. And you see here there's a road that runs down the middle of or not middle, I guess. It's closer to the Union line, but there's Emmitsburg Road, which runs down the side here. And this is going to be a important landmark as the battle commences. And we can see Meade is up here on Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and it's a very strong position, right? The Union is behind a kind of rock wall, and they've been there for the last 2 days, so they've had a lot of time to reinforce their position. So the Union is really hunkered down, and the rebels really have a hell of a task in front of them. So the infantry march, right? So the Confederates, right, roughly 12,500 men in estimation, were going to be taking part in this assault. As I said earlier, and as the artist's reinterpretation showed, the land had dips and crests of the hill. So as the men were marching, as the rebels were crossing the field, they would, go down a dip and they would disappear from view entirely. And then they would come up the next hill and you would see them, and then they'd dip down again. And, just kind of an interesting, and I think it would have been, certainly a sight to behold. Now, the 12,500 Confederates, right, were lined up, in straight lines, in straight rows. And this line ended up being about a mile long, right? So you had a mile-long line of men marching across the field in kind of one great, force, right? And of course, too, right, these are, farmers' fields. So there's rocks, there's fences, there's other obstacles. And once the Confederates started to walk, started their march, the Union cannons reopened fire. Right, so the rebels, being under the impression that most of the Union artillery had been destroyed, quickly found out that that was not the case. And once the march was underway, the rebels did not retreat, or they didn't turn around, and so the cannons continued to fire onto them. So as the Confederates started to march across the field, the Union men began to chant "Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg." Now, if you missed the episode, or it's been a little while, if you go back to the playlist, I did an episode on Fredericksburg, one of the first episodes I did. And if you recall, the Union was in a very similar situation, where they had to march across a field to a heavily defensed, Confederate position at Fredericksburg, and it failed. And so the Union boys are ready to pay back for Fredericksburg a little bit. So, as they said, the Confederates had to go about 2 miles, right, across this field. And once they were about 400 yards from the Union position, which we'll go back to this, right, so Emmitsburg Pike, or Emmitsburg Road, is about, 400 to 500 yards away from the Union position, okay? So by the time that this line reaches Emmitsburg Road, the original mile-long line was about half a mile line, right? So about 2/3 of the rebel force had already been incapacitated from either fleeing from the field, being blown up from cannon fire, or simply, laying down and refusing to move forward any further. So we can really see that Longstreet was correct in his assessment that this was a terrible idea. So, fish in a barrel. I think I spelled barrel wrong. Oh well. The Union forces, right, like I said, were sheltered behind the rocks on Seminary Ridge. And like I said, once they were about, 400 to 300 yards out, this is whenever the Union muskets would have started to become effective, right? That would have been effective range for these weapons. They start beginning, pouring fire into the rebels. So Emmitsburg Road, which we just talked about, has a depression, right? So there's like an embankment on one side of the road, and many of the Confederate men laid down, on behind this embankment, used it as cover, and a lot of them refused to fight, right? They laid down, they protected themselves, and once the battle was over, they simply surrendered to the Union side. The Union guns, if you look down here in the bottom right, up on Cemetery Hill, the Union guns that were placed up there absolutely decimated roads in the left side of the line. And in fact, Brockenborough's division, or brigade, would have been Brockenborough's brigade, fled, right? They started taking cannon fire. They said, nope, I don't want any part of this. and they ran back to Seminary Ridge. Now, seeing this, a lot of other Confederate divisions, they decided to run as well, right? They said, hey, they're running, we're running. And this led to chaos, a bit of chaos, and you can't blame them, because the Union line in many places was actually 4 men deep, right? So this meant that, the person at the very front of the line, at the Union line, would fire and then step back, reload. Another man would step up, fire, step back, reload. Another man step up, fire, reload. And this meant that there was rapid firing, because you had, a whole minute to reload your weapon, get back into position, and fire again. So there's a constant musket fire. So, these guys fleeing, I don't blame them. I sure as hell would have ran. Now, let's talk about Brigadier General Alexander Hayes, right? So, if we go back to part 1, I talked about, there being some guys who deserve to be remembered, or I think are important to the story. And Brigadier General Alexander Hayes, for me, is one of those people. So, even though the Union position was so strong and, they had such an advantage, they were still taking losses, right? And so Alexander Hayes was riding back and forth behind his line, yelling to his men, "Hurrah, boys, we're giving them hell." He's encouraging his men to continue to fight. But of course, being on horseback, you are a target, right? And so Hayes's horse actually got shot out from under him. Hayes was uninjured, so he got himself another horse and rode back and forth across the line, yelling to his men whenever this horse was shot out from under him. So Brigadier General Alexander Hayes of the Union Army had 2 horses shot out from under him during this battle, and fortunately he remained uninjured, and he got himself a 3rd horse. And after the fighting had ceased, Alexander Hayes stole or acquired a rebel flag and dragged it on the ground behind him as he ran or rode his horse in front of his men. So this was it's something that comes up in a lot of memoirs, that Brigadier General Alexander Hayes kind of has this. It's a neat little pin in his hat, if you will. So the angle, right? Let's talk about the Union line a little bit. And one of the places of the worst fighting, I guess the deadliest fighting on both sides, is a place called the Angle, right? So, give me 1 second here. Let me get something to drink. So the Angle, right? So after reaching Emmitsburg Road, a lot of men laid down, right, and refused to get up. But a lot more men decided to continue on. And the place right in front of them was the Angle. This was a low stone wall that made a 90-degree turn in the Union line. And this would have been a bit of a weakness for the Union. So the 69th and 71st Pennsylvania held the Angle, with the 4th Artillery placed just in front of them at a stone fence, right? As the rebels advanced, right, over Emmitsburg Road, the 71st Pennsylvania and the 59th New York, who were supporting the 71st and 69th Pennsylvania, fled, right? They ran away. And so Brigadier General Henry Hunt, who was commander of the artillery, ordered his guns to be loaded with double shot, right? We're going to put 2 shots into the cannons, and we're going to launch it at the enemy, right? And like I said, Emmitsburg Road is about 400 to 300 yards away. So this is extremely close range. And what this meant was that the Confederate line basically disappeared. There were no more rebels left after this cannon fire. Or at least that part of the Union. It's a, small part of a much larger force. But long story short, these guys are gone. But after firing, the artillery had no more ammo, right? This was the last of it. And so the 268 men of the 69th Pennsylvania were left to deal with the roughly 2,500 men of Lewis Armistead, who was the Confederate commander, right? So you got 268 men against 2,500 Confederates. Now, you can see here, this is a picture of the angle, and you can see again, this tree line here in the back would have been where the rebels would have walked out of, and across this field. These fences would not have been here, or perhaps different fences, right? These are modern fence designs. Back in the 1800s, they built fences differently. We're not going to get into that specifically, but this is a general idea of what the boys would have been fighting over. So, part 2 of the angle, right? So, the 69th Pennsylvania, the 268 men that were left after the 71st Pennsylvania and 59th New York fled, made up mostly of Irishmen. They were fighting in hand-to-hand combat. The 72nd Pennsylvania saw the 71st flee and moved up after a short delay to fill the gap and support the 69th Pennsylvania. In the confusion, right, the Union line is collapsing, guys are fleeing, people are moving up, there's a lot of chaos. The Confederates actually managed to take the guns of the 4th Artillery, but there was no ammo left. So there was, they got the guns, they turned them around, they went to load it, and no ammo. And another thing too, the majority of the Confederate commanders were dead at this point, right? Once the rebels got to the angle and started to breach the line, the majority of the commanders were dead, so there was a lot of chaos. And at this point, most of the rebels are either surrendering or they're heading back to Cemetery Ridge after being whipped. So from after the artillery barrage, right, once Pickett gave the orders to begin marching forward, and the whole thing was over in about an hour, right? About an hour. That's how long this engagement took. Let's talk about casualties, right? So 6,600 Confederates were incapacitated, right? Wounded, killed, captured, like I said, and 3,000 of which estimated were taken as POWs by the Union, right? So almost half were taken as prisoners of war. The rest were either dead or wounded. Of the 40 field officers in the Confederate Army that had set out as part of Pickett's division, only 14 returned, right? So we're talking about colonels, lieutenants, sergeants. Of the 40 field officers, only 14 returned. Now, like I said, the Union casualties, they suffered casualties as well, but it was only about 1,500 casualties, right? Winfield Scott Hancock, who was a Union commander, was fatally wounded by Lewis Armistead's men. And this is a little ironic because both men were friends, right? They had served together in the American Army during the Mexican-American War. And Lou Armistead was wounded, right? And he died 3 days later, but he had enough time to talk to Longstreet and say, hey, can you give Mrs. Hancock my Bible? And Longstreet did follow through on Armistead's dying wish. So the aftermath, right? So with his men limping back, right, to Seminary Ridge, Lee began to organize a defensive position, right? Because the Union had just refused this massive assault. Of course, they're going to come charging back at us, right? They're going to counterattack. So Lee begins to organize his men, let's rally up, boys, get defensive positions, let's get ready. But quickly, Lee realized that the Union attack was not manifesting. The Union being satisfied with their defense, they would not, seek to attack. And once Lee realized that the attack wasn't coming, he began to consolidate his men, right? Men, I'm sorry, this was my fault. This was a bad decision. I shouldn't have done this. And Lee approached Pickett, and he said, General Pickett, you have to look to your division rally your men. We have to, there's still more fighting to happen. Pickett responded to General Lee quite famously, General Lee, I have no division. And in fact, like I said, beginning of the episode, many of Lee's commanders never forgave him for this attack, and Pickett certainly did not either. Until his dying day, Pickett had resented Lee for this terrible plan. So after, and why didn't the Union attack, right? They just wiped out 6,000 of the Confederates. Surely all the Union have to do is walk down the hill and assault the Confederate position, and, for all we know, they might have ended the war right then and there. Well, we can't forget about part one, right? 2 days of heavy fighting, Devil's Den, Little Round Top. The Union was just as tired as the Confederates. So a Union assault would have been potentially catastrophic. So Meade, preferring to stay on the high ground, and on the morning of July 4th, a unofficial truce was put into effect. Hey, we're done fighting. Go and collect your dead, tend to your wounded, and we'll fight another day, is basically what both sides had agreed to. And that's about it, right? So that's pretty much the entire battle, all kind of culminating in this large Confederate offensive known as Pickett's Charge. That's actually another thing too. Pickett resented the fact that this terrible idea was named after him, and you can't really blame him either. It was Lee's plan. Longstreet gave the order. Pickett was just the guy who had to, lead the attack. And so, Pickett kind of always resented that his name was attached to this terrible, stupid idea. Right, so after the fourth day, Lee gathers his men, and they begin to march south back into Virginia. And this is actually the furthest north that Lee would reach. He would never cross the Mason-Dixon line for the rest of the war. And despite the amount of casualties that Lee had suffered over these last 3 days of battle, the war stretched on for another 2 years, right? So this terrible conflict of Gettysburg, we're talking over 50,000 men, dead or wounded or, POWs on both sides. The war still managed to continue on for another 2 years, which to me is just, I don't know, man. It's crazy. It really is. It really is crazy. But yeah, so that's it, right? That's Gettysburg, man. So I appreciate you guys listening. Let's see, any closing remarks? Not really. I don't know what I'm gonna do next, but it'll be up at some point. Like I said, always, please, if you can, like, comment, subscribe, and check out the other episodes. Go back and listen to them. And yeah, so I guess that's the end of the podcast. Goodbye. Peace.